Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm Lon Schiffbauer, and today we are going to talk about protectionism. So if we pull this on up, let's get into this. Now, first of all, we've discussed the idea of free trade, the idea that there is an unencumbered flow of goods and services across borders around the world. In other words, no trade barriers. That's what unencumbered trade means. No trade barriers. The thing is, there is no such thing as absolute free trade. No such thing as free trade. And yet, in order for comparative advantage to work, something we talked about in a previous lecture, let's see, I'll put a little link to it up there. In order for comparative advantage to really work its magic, we need to have as much free trade as possible. Nevertheless, it doesn't really happen that way. Today, what we're going to talk about is what sort of trade barriers are there and why do we use them? Why do we put them in place if they get in the way of free trade and comparative advantage? So let's explore that. Let's first define what sort of trade barriers are used in the marketplace today. Now, the first one is a tariff. You've probably heard the word tariff before. This is a tax levied on imports or exports. So, for example, let's take a look at example. In late 2020, just a few months ago at the recording of this video, the European Union, the EU, placed a tariff upon imports of hot-rolled stainless steel from countries of China, Indonesia, Taiwan. Now, the reason they did this is because an investigation showed that these countries were artificially lowering the prices of their steel when selling abroad, right? So we're going to go into more detail on the why of trade practices. But the important thing to understand right now is a trade tariff is a tax placed upon an import. So this means that the European Union is placing a tax on steel coming in from China, Indonesia, and Taiwan, making the steel more expensive. Well, now, why would they make the steel more expensive? Because they don't want you to buy steel from these countries. They want you to buy steel either domestically or from other countries. Okay, so that's a trade tariff. Let's continue on. Next are subsidies. Now, a subsidy is a government payment to a producer intended to lower the cost of goods manufactured and encourage industry growth. Now, once again, we are going to talk about the whys of this here fairly soon, but in looking at an example, these are subsidies that the US government has given to energy power manufacturers, right? The energy sector. And as we see, the US government has subsidized a lot of fossil fuels, but lately has increased their subsidies of renewable energy and energy efficiency, and even a little bit of nuke, although nuke is dropping down. Now, once again, why we're going to talk about, but in this case, it's pretty clear. The country, any country, needs good, solid, reliable, affordable energy and increasingly renewable, efficient energy. And so the government provides a subsidy to help encourage business to explore renewable energies. We're going to go more into the whys here in a moment, though. Excuse me. We'll just make sure that we understand the idea of a subsidy. Next one is an import quota, a restriction on the quantity of goods that can be brought into a country. All right. So you're only allowed to import in so many of X product before you say, no more, can't do any more this year. Well, here's an interesting example for you. If you go out to U.S. Customs and Border Protection and look at commodities subject to quotas. What does the U.S. have quotas on? Brooms, whisk brooms, other brooms. The heck? What is going on with brooms? Okay, well, you can do your own investigation into that if you're curious. But yeah, there's a lot of quotas on things like brooms, broom handles, whisk brooms, and so forth. We, the United States, can only import in so many before we can say, no more, you now have to buy domestically. Yes, it's a way of protecting a domestic industry. And apparently the broom lobby is stronger than I would have thought. Okay, well, then we have local content requirements. Now, these are policies set forth by governments that require firms or government entities to use domestically produced, or little typo there, domestically produced goods or services deemed vital to the economy of a nation, okay? So here's the idea. These are things that are important to the country that we need a ready supply of, and we want to protect those industries that provide those goods to us. So, for example, once again, in the United States, we have something called the Buy American Act. And this act requires government agencies to give preference to products in which 51% or greater of the material is produced domestically. Now, with the case of many governments around the world, and the US government is no exception, the government is like the largest buyer of goods in the country quite often. And so by saying, hey, the largest buyer of goods needs to give preference to locally produced goods, this creates a great incentive for people to produce domestically. Okay, so it's not so much a barrier as to outside goods as it is an incentive for internal. Although it is a barrier when you really think about it, because this means that goods outside of a particular country cannot be sold or not easily sold to a foreign government. Okay, so these are different practices. Now, once again, for free trade to work unfettered and for comparative advantage to work its magic, we shouldn't have trade barriers. So why do we? Okay, well, we touched upon some of the reasons. Let's go into a little bit more depth. The first argument is infant industry. This is giving an industry a short-term, indirect subsidy through protection, or in some cases, a direct subsidy. So, for example, if you take energy in a country may say, hey, listen, it's really, really important to us, which we're going to talk about in a later reason here. It's really important to us that we have a consistent, predictable, ready, affordable supply of energy. So to do that, we are going to protect our energy producers and subsidize them. So a country may choose to put a tariff on foreign oil so that local oil producers or oil producers with whom the country has a stronger relationship with can get into the market more easily. Or they may subsidize local energy producers, especially when it comes to renewable energy, to give these sort of companies a chance to get a leg up. You take renewable energy, for example, it's much more expensive, or at least used to be much more expensive than fossil fuels, but because of subsidies and government purchasing and so forth, it has become more and more affordable. Now, it should be done strategically, not just for any industry. It's for an industry where you feel like you have an opportunity to be a world-class provider, right? So energy is a great example of this. Now, another one is anti-dumping. So you remember the example of the EU placing tariffs upon Chinese, Indonesian, Taiwan steel. That's because these countries were selling steel at below cost. All right. Here's the idea. Let's say it cost me 40 cents to make a part, right? I sell it for $1, so I'm making 60 cents profit. In another country, it cost my competitor 40 cents to make the same part. However, I sell my part in that country for 30 cents. All right, so that means I'm taking a loss. I'm going to sell it in that country for 30 cents, taking a loss of 10 cents a part. But why would I do that? Because my competitor can't compete and so goes out of business. And then when my competitor goes out of business, now I can ratchet up prices because I am the only provider. Okay, this is what's considered dumping. And the EU's investigation found that China, Indonesia, and Taiwan were producing and selling steel at below cost, which is harming harming the EU's industries. Okay. All right. Another one is environmental protection. Different countries have different laws, rules, and regulations around environmental protection and so forth. And so a country may choose to place a tariff or a quota or some other barrier upon a product from a country that is not exercising good, strong environmental practices. Okay, so it can be an incentive for that country then to increase its environmental regulations because, golly gee willikers, we want access to that market and they're not letting us in because of our environmental practices. So we need to increase these so we can get access to the market. Now, it's the exact same argument when it comes to consumer safety. Not all countries have the same laws, rules, regulations around consumer safety. And so if a particular product is deemed to be unsafe in a country, they will place barriers upon that, or maybe even barriers on the country as a whole because of systemic practices across all the industries. So once again, it's set up as an incentive for countries to increase safety regulations. Same thing goes with human rights abuses. Maybe a country will set up barriers against another country to encourage that country to put in place stronger human rights regulations and to enforce them. And then we have national interest. Okay. A country should not depend too heavily on others for certain key products, such as oil, steel, or special materials or technologies that have national security applications, such as military materials and technologies. So here's the idea. For national security, you need oil, baby. You need power. You need energy. And for national security, you need steel. Steel is what is used in every aspect of building a country's and maintaining a country's infrastructure. And so a country does not want to be put in a position where their national interest, their ability to produce these things, is put at risk by the trade practices of another country. So, for example, if we go back to the EU and China, well, who cares if China's dumping steel in the EU? They get cheap steel. No, remember, the way dumping works is it undercuts the local producers of steel. So those EU countries like Germany and France and Brussels and Belgium, and all those EU countries and so forth, now their steel producers are at risk because they can't compete with this artificially inexpensive steel. So that means these industries go out of business, And now national security is at risk because they can no longer produce a vital element to their nation's needs. So that's why a country will put in place trade barriers to protect its national interest. All right. So folks, there you go. That is a quick primer on protectionism, what it does to free trade. It hinders free trade, and yet why we do it. Sometimes they're pretty valid, good reasons. Sometimes not so much. All right. So I hope this was helpful. Stick around. We have more coming. And until then, you have a fantastic day.